All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Pandey, and I'm a reporter with Axios. I cover a lot of things over there. We have a small news organization. We're very new. But mostly I focus on how technology is changing cities and societies, and most importantly, work. And so it's great to be here at this Future of Work conference, and I'm especially excited about the topic we're looking at today. I've moderated a number of panels on the future of work, in my career, and mostly diversity and inclusion gets tacked on sort of 5 minutes at the end, and I'm so happy to see it get its own stage and so early in the conference, so we can sort of set this tone for the rest of the discussions. And it was great also to see it discussed in the last session. I've got here with me a very awesome, distinguished panel. We have Michelle Miller from coworker.org, Diane Antishin from DT Energy, and Yrthya Dinzey-Flores from Warner Media. And I think I'm going to ask them sort of one question to open it, and then let them sort of introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about what they do and how they come at this super important issue of work in the inclusive organization. So I think the way I want to frame this discussion to start off, how are the same tech forces that are changing work, that are changing jobs, that are changing our cities, threatening the diversity and inclusion in our organizations? What actually is the crux of the problem here? And I'll let you start, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Tech fail. Thank you so much. So my name is Michelle Miller. I'm the co-founder and co-director of an organization called Coworker. We support efforts by people inside their workplaces to join together collectively and shift power, both over specific issues and then in the general decision-making process of their workplaces. So we've supported folks at Comcast call centers, Starbucks baristas, Google, other places where people had ideas about how they wanted to change their workplace. I really believe that part of what we're seeing is a product of overall weakening worker power, which the last panel covered extensively. When workers do not have a place from which they can ensure that their needs are getting met, it is difficult for firms to actually be able to directly address issues that arise from a lack of diversity and inclusion. I also would build on the description that Sarita gave of the fissuring and disaggregation of the workplace. When half of the people that are working in a particular company are from outsourced or contracted entities, even the most well-intentioned, thoughtful firm that has a strong diversity and inclusion policy for their own employees doesn't have control or is limited in the control they can exercise over the experiences of people of color, and women, and queer people who are working for the contracted or subcontracted entity. And so when we put these barriers in place between the people who are working within the umbrella of a firm, but that they don't have the same standing as full-time employees who are directly employed by that firm, you're creating a kind of division in terms of power that reinforces issues around diversity and equity.
I'll give it to Diane. Sure.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Diane Antishin, and I am Vice President of HR Operations and our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at DT Energy. Some of you may be familiar with DT Energy. We're actually headquartered just a couple miles down the road from where we're visiting today. At DT Energy, we have an aspiration to be a force for growth and prosperity in the communities where we live and serve. We boil all of those words down to being a force for good. And I actually lead the education and employment pillar of how we structured that work into 6 different categories: environment, communities, education, employment, et cetera. And so I'm very much enmeshed in issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion through my role at DT Energy. And I think this is a very important question, the role of technology and the speed of change that is all around us, and how are we working as organizations to counteract those forces that are so present in our world today that are, frankly, I think in many ways pulling us apart. I think of social media and the echo chamber that can create for individuals who, only want to hear one perspective on a particular topic and are constantly getting inbound messaging, advertisements, and so forth that reinforce those same types of ideas without the real opportunity to engage in thoughtful dialogue, as Michelle mentioned, gig economy and the notions of flex work. You know, flexible work is what pretty much every young person coming into our organization wants, but we really grapple with that and have to think very deliberately about ways to connect individuals so that they can build those critical relationships that are so important to speeding the nature of work. Without relationships, we know that things take more time, they grind to a halt, there's misunderstandings, and we've got this changing world of work, and so how do we design very deliberately to bring people together, to allow them to collaborate, to allow them to get to know each other, kind of what are the hallmarks of the culture that we're trying to create in terms of an inclusive environment. So I come at this work and I always start from kind of a place of worry when it comes to technology, but I think as our conversation evolves here this morning, I'll take us to a place of optimism because I do think technology can also help us solve a lot of these problems.
Hi, my name is Yrthya Dinzey-Flores, and I describe myself as a designer of corporate responsibility and workplace inclusion practices. I most recently did that at Warner Media, which most of you will know as the company that holds HBO, Warner Brothers, and formerly Turner, but a bunch of brands under that together. And I think to your question, part of the challenge is that I don't think that we've come to a realization about the fact that workplaces need to change. I think we are categorically and sort of inherently or obstinately is the word I'm looking for, stuck in this sense that, you know, we've defined success and we know what it looks like and we've been practicing that for many, many years in the same way, particularly in corporate America, and we sort of, there's a refusal to admit that the rules have to change, that the priorities need to be reorganized, and that the way in which we design work needs to be designed for tomorrow, for the future, and not just based on the practices that we've felt so comfortable with. So part of the challenge, I think, in this is that, you know, we sort of have two ships kind of coming at each other, threatening to clash, and we've not designed a way to orchestrate how those two things dance together, right? How they sort of manage these sort of turbulent waters. And, you know, technology is disrupting in a way, but because we still have these sort of stale practices from the past, we're sort of falling into the same patterns, right, of not having enough technologists who are black women, right, of not having enough people with different abilities designing, right, for those same tools that are helping to solve problems for people who are differently abled. So I do think that part of it is that our psyche, right, our institutions still have a reticence to change and have not acknowledged that is absolutely necessary in order for us to change this dynamic.
Ton to dig into here. I want to start with this notion of pulling us apart, these forces, as you mentioned, Diane. You talked about remote work and flex work. Survey after survey has shown that Americans want this option. Employers are okay with this option, but there doesn't seem to exist a framework out there to keep our organizations together if they do have contracted workers or flex workers or remote workers. Have any of you seen anything that works out there, or are we really lacking any kind of, you know, first step here? And I'll let any of you take that.
I mean, I think years ago, Bank of America had gone on sort of like really far ahead on this whole idea of remote working, and they had sort of diminished their physical footprint. I think 5 or 6 years ago, they sort of took it back a little bit. This is not a criticism on them. I think it's just a reflection of sort of how it's challenging. On the other hand, I mean, some of the positions that I've held have been in global companies, and the truth about it is that if you can't work remotely with people when you have a global role, there's no way to get the work done, right? Because if you work on a team where people are in Hong Kong or India and you're based in Minnesota, guess what? You have about 3 hours of the day when you're going to align, when you're sort of both awake and can do work, right? So this notion that we aren't able to do it, I think is not necessarily realistic because it does happen in pockets. It's really about sort of, again, our sort of feeling about it, right? What is it that we feel comfortable with in terms of understanding our people being contributing on the level that we feel that they should contribute? and that if I don't see you on a daily basis, oh, is that my cue to get off? I feel like the Oscars. I'm sorry, I went on too long. I'm going to pass the mic. I kind of lost my train of thought. But this notion that I have to see you in order to believe that what you're contributing has value, right? That's about my level of comfort, right, with sort of the evidence presented in front of me versus a trust factor that needs to exist with workers, which I think is another topic for a panel, right? Sort of trust levels about workers, between workers and institutions and their employers.
Yeah, I would just add to that there's no easy way to solve these types of issues. Again, the world of work is changing, whether it's flex work, gig work, whatever it may be. But organizations need to think very thoughtfully about the ways that they're going to design to bring people together. So yeah, we can create technology solutions. We're in the midst of rolling out enterprise-wide our Microsoft Teams, which is a collaborative software that allows people to connect much more fluidly wherever they are doing work. And so technology can assist. But I think that one of the risks that we have is that work becomes just transactional. We gather only for the purpose of, delivering on this particular aspect of a project. And when that is done, we all go back to, our siloed work, and then we come together maybe a week later and we're working on the next phase of that project. And again, organizations serve a bigger purpose, I think, than just getting the fundamental work done. I mean, when we think back on our careers, the people who have mentored us, guided us, who have nurtured our careers, who have helped us deal with personal issues, who have helped us figure out how to, handle having kids at a young age and working simultaneously. Those are things that you typically don't get when you're calling overseas at 3 a.m. to join on a conference call. You're there just to get the work done at that particular moment. So organizations, I think, have an additional challenge and burden with the changing nature of work to be really thoughtful about what are the ways that we are going to work to bring those teams together. It may be difficult to do that with some frequency if half the team was described as in Hong Kong or Germany or wherever, but how are we thoughtfully thinking about creating the space so that people can build relationships, get to know each other, provide that support, that coaching, that informal part of our culture that can be so meaningful to attracting and retaining employees. And so I just urge people to not leave that to chance in the changing world of work and just focus only on the technology part of it, because I think then we'll have organizations that still experience some challenges along the way.
I just really want to appreciate both the ways in which we keep returning to these ideas of trust and intentionality from a management perspective, because I do think that, in terms of disaggregation or people being in multiple work environments, from the worker end, our entire platform is designed to facilitate connection across multiple locations between people who've never met one another before, tackling workplace issues. And what we've seen is that in those moments, trust is able to be built between people who are working in a place, and that new ideas spring up, and that people are able to sort of track patterns across their experiences and say, and sort of get to the root of what the problem is. And that if that's what people are able to do sort of in the ad hoc, informal way that they do it on our platform, I really do believe that there are bigger structures that are possible to build that make it possible to bring that directly to their workplaces, and that's what we see them do all the time. Something that I agree with Diane about being worried about is the impact of sort of algorithmic management software and outsourcing certain aspects of management to robots, where that depletes the ability of workers to come to any sort of formal authority and actually negotiate around outcomes. And I would imagine that on the management side, that's also something that feels really frustrating, that there are so many technologies that are being experimented with and introduced and also pitched to HR departments that suggest that they will alleviate the burden of performance evaluation and management, that they will increase equity and diversity outcomes because the robot is less biased than the person, which we know is just absolutely not true, that is often built on data that contains its own bias, and that I think on in both labor and in management, we have an opportunity to be really thoughtful about making a decision together about what we want to implement inside of workplaces to ensure that people do have the most opportunities for fairness and equity, and also have the ability to contest decisions, to discuss decisions, to think about what the best policies are for all workers.
That's such a great point. It makes me think of, I visited an Amazon fulfillment center recently, and they have automated productivity tracking and even firing systems, and that can go horribly wrong sometimes. And tech is being infused into the recruitment process as well, which I think is super, super interesting. And another huge part of D&I is just attracting the diversity. How do you think about sort of how employers can work with educators or their own HR departments to make sure they're recruiting the right way? And any of you can jump in on that.
Yeah, I think Michelle hit upon some of the concerns, though, on that front, too, right? So many new tools and so forth that are designed to help eliminate bias from selection processes, whether that be, blinding of resumes through electronic means, just keying in on key job qualifications, not looking for kind of any superfluous information about hobbies or family or anything else like that. There's great new software out there. Talkio is one of them that recently was pitched to our organization, and ways to help your job descriptions become much more gender or ethnically neutral, so they can remove certain words that may speak to certain audiences from your job description and replace them with words that speak more broadly or speak to the particular minority group that you are looking to attract within an organization. So there is so much design out there that technology can bring to organizations to help improve your recruiting processes. But I think Michelle's forewarning is very important. We be careful, because there's bias built into the systems that are being promoted as ways to eliminate bias too. So we've got to be very, very careful in terms of which tools we select in order to advance that work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of work we can all do to really request transparency from the companies that are pitching this software about how their software is engaging in decision making. One of the things that researchers have found, I think this first came up through a report from Data and Society, is that the kind of additional information that hiring algorithms some are using to weigh a prospective candidate are based on things like zip code. So there is a study that said that if you live less than 5 miles away from the place where you work, you're more likely to stay there longer. And if you think about that in the context of redlining, and where communities of color have been pushed into certain neighborhoods and moved out of others, and then you line that up with your recruiting software, that is a proxy for bias. There is another common way that people are weeded out, where they determine long-term retention potential based on what browser extension you use. If you're using a default browser extension, it says that I don't even understand the logic of this, but that you're less likely to stay. And so if you think about somebody who doesn't own a computer and has to go to a public library to apply for a job, like, there are all of these ways in which these seemingly neutral and benign presumptions made about potential for retention and potential for good employees end up being proxies for bias. And there's so much work we can all do to start to really ask deep questions about what are the various metrics that the software is using to make decisions about who's qualified for the work. And what are the ways in which we can I think that there's a policy solution here where we're building policy around insisting that there's more algorithmic transparency in order to not violate potential EEOC regulations. And then the last thing I'll say is that there is a spate of technology like the video service HireVue, where they promise to determine trustworthiness based on your micro expressions in a video interview, and to really question what we are trying to solve for by using that kind of technology.
I mean, I think that's also an especially interesting point, and memory doesn't serve right, but there's a sort of brilliant researcher who's been doing a lot of work around AI, right? And the way in which sort of facial recognition software just immediately, sort of discriminates against, sort of 80% of the people who get on AI, and especially for people who are very dark skinned, it doesn't recognize their facial features. And so, there are all of these ways in which we need to participate in the design, which is sort of, again, back to the question of, and sort of the topic of who's participating in the solutions, and are we being inclusive enough in ensuring that there's representation from sort of underrepresented voices in all parts of the design of the system. And the other thing I will add about recruiting is also that we've been talking for many, many years, and this is not going to be foreign to anyone in this audience, about the benefits of diversity, about casting a wider net, about the Rooney Rule, all of these things, right, which we all accept as things that are very reasonable that we should be doing, and yet we're not doing them, right? And so I think that there's also that other reality of putting these things in practices is going to take more than just sort of the evidence. It takes a certain amount of will and commitment about it not just being the right thing to do, and about it not only making sense in terms of business, but just about the fact that our companies need to do it in order to remain competitive.
So we have just over 10 minutes left, so I just want to do a call out for Slido questions for us to get to. And while that's going, I do want to ask, before we get to the good news part of it, there is sort of a move fast, break things ethos of Silicon Valley that has been talked about and is more and more coming under fire. Given that, is there a role for governments and policymakers to play here? You mentioned it a little bit, Michelle, but when it comes to thinking about these algorithms, thinking about even who has internet, who doesn't, who has a smartphone and can use it and who doesn't, there are all these structural issues that it seems like companies themselves can't fix. And what is that role?
Yes. I mean, it is increasingly clear to all of us that the thing that we used to think of as tech policy, as just like the policy of how we govern technology, is also should be understood as economic policy. That because of the role that tech platforms, that technology software play in people's access to jobs, credit, housing, education, the ways in which this software is introduced into the allocation of resources from the public welfare system, the way that they're used in the mass incarceration system, all of these ways of determining who's in and who's out in our culture mean that there is a massive amount of work from a policy standpoint to do to ensure that the private power and private firms are not the only folks who are making decisions that have ripple effects around equity for everybody in our culture. So I think there's a lot that can be done.
And that question I've seen up there about paid leave.
Yeah. I'll jump in on that one because, yes, we've got a Slido question on the same question that you were asking about what can government policies do to help create more inclusion. And so, this issue of paid leave for paternity, maternity is just so important. We at DTE about 3 years ago created a maternity paternity policy so that a paid leave of 4 weeks for men and women, beyond for women the natural kind of disability benefits that we have with sick time off. And it has been so incredibly positively received within our organizations by men and women alike, who are so thankful for the opportunity to spend time with their newborn and to get reacclimated to work over a period of time. We don't require that those 4 weeks be taken immediately after birth. They can be taken over a 2-year period of time. And it's frankly shameful that the United States is the only developed country in the world without a paid leave policy for childbirth. And so that is something that I think can make a tremendous difference in helping young families to navigate what is one of the most challenging and exciting periods of their lives.
Yeah, I'm reading the Slido questions. There's one specific for you and I, Diane, about DTE Energy and Warner Media, and programs about transparency in the culture, which seem to be an important founding aspect for inclusion. Yeah, I mean, I think that, culture is a tricky thing to develop transparency around, right? I mean, I think it depends a little bit on how your company is organized. What I will say at Warner Media, because the company has been going through this transition as it is now part of AT&T, is that there has been some cultural change there. But the ways in which we traditionally built transparency was to set very clear goals around diversity in terms of leadership at the top of the house, right? And so very clear goals that people understood, particularly at the VP plus level. And the second way we did that was also by having a very robust employee resource group network that was very well resourced and supported by not just the leadership in the company, but also with dollars, which, sort of you put your money where your mouth is. And I think the third ways that we did it was by having a very express commitment to diversity and inclusion and chiming in when things would impact our workers, right? We have a family leave policy is what we like to call it, which is not gender specific. It's just a family leave, which is triggered by an event, whether it's adoption or birth or whatever it may be. And it is not contingent on marriage. So things like that, right, that sort of expressed to our workers and policies like that, that we really care about them is the way in which we build a sort of a very inclusive culture where people were allowed to thrive, in addition to development programs and all of those other things. But culture is something that I think has contributed from many aspects, not just the D&I, sort of the diversity and inclusion function.
And I would just add to what you're described, creating a culture of inclusion and transparency, I think also goes to employee voice and ensuring that employees have the opportunity to speak up and be listened to and heard and responded to address the concerns that are there. And so we approach that in a number of ways at DTE Energy. I mean, first and foremost, we do a wall-to-wall employee survey twice a year in which we ask employees what's working really well, what's one thing that you would change. And we don't just kind of note those results and put them off to the side. We work those throughout the ensuing 6 months to ensure that we're closing the loop in feedback with our employees. Our CEO every quarter stands up in front of all of our employees in a session that's literally called Ask Me Anything. And Ask Me Anything is what happens during those sessions. So again, we work very hard to create a two-way dialogue to create much more transparency in our organization.
I wanted to address the top question there because I think it's a really good question and it lifts up some issues that we've certainly seen. So if that's okay. So I strongly agree with the point made in that question, and if you can't see it, it's why do we keep thinking relationships are so important? As a Black woman, most of the workplace challenges have come from these forced relationships and not my work. And so a few of the things that I just want to talk about are, from our perspective at Coworker, we think relationships are only functional when they are coming from a place of equal power. And a lot of times, most times, what we're seeing is that they are not, that there's a presumed equality of power, but not an actual functional quality of power. And we did 3 years ago, when we first started getting contacted by folks working in the tech sector, we did a survey of people of color across multiple tech companies about whether or not the diversity pipeline efforts were actually resulting in people of color having a good experience working inside tech companies. And what we found was that for many folks who were hired through diversity pipelines, the experience was that they would get to the company, there was little actual structure in place for folks to actually have any kind of power to change the culture, and that it was deeply unfair to put the burden of changing an entire corporate culture on a couple of people of color hired into an organization when no other effort was being made. And on top of that, it is labor. It is labor to deal with the diversity and equity issues inside of a company. And it is often unpaid labor, and it is most often labor that is taken on, as this person says, by black women and by other women of color. And so I think that in order for this to actually be for these problems to actually be solved, that the act of building a diverse and equitable culture has to be one that is taken on by people in power. Power has to be shared, and most importantly, it has to be recognized as labor, compensated as labor, and structured as something that is not just like a nice thing that people have a place they can go at the end of the day to talk in their employee resource group, but actually a part of decision making and power building inside a company.
Yeah, I'll just take that point and link it to a question that's no longer on the Slido queue, but to say, I think Kimberly Crenshaw talks a lot about sort of power dynamics in the workplace and policy, and the way in which we sort of build policy in the workplace and how those power dynamics impact it. She's really great. She's a professor at Harvard, a law professor at Harvard. She's really brilliant. We've brought her to our company to do a couple of sessions in the past. So I would urge that, and I would link it to the question that was on the Slido about how will future of work impact women. And what I would like to say is that, you know, it is impacting women, not in necessarily great ways in terms of representation in so many areas, but it is also impacting women on different levels, right? So women of color tend to always be on the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to opportunities, right? And to progressing in organizations. So that is an issue that we, I think, still need to address and contend with in our communities. As a Latina and as a black woman, I get it twice, not just once. And I think it's an issue that we really need to address when we talk about the future of work for women. It is not an inclusive statement to just say women. We need to sort of be very vigilant about the women of color piece as well.
Super important point to focus on. I want to end just quickly. We have about 2 minutes. I would like to hear very briefly from all of you. What's one thing that makes you hopeful about the future of work?
Organizing. We're seeing, right now, we're seeing lots of workers use a lot of existing technology that's really easy to access to engage in their own kind of collective power building. There is this salary transparency spreadsheet fire rocketing its way through multiple industries that we've been tracking. Adjuncts, arts and museums, baristas, the legal industry, the media industry, tech, publishing, architecture. I mean, like, everybody got a spreadsheet. And those seem like small things, but they are actually critically important to starting to build people's awareness around the ways in which salaries are often distributed in a way that is unequal and unfair, and also giving people their first step into taking action inside their workplace. So I think that's very exciting, and it's aided by tech.
One thing that makes me excited about the future of work and the blend of technology comes from the story of Airbnb. And some of you may have had a chance to tune into Joe Gebbia's TED Talk on Airbnb and how they are designing to build trust. It's a great TED Talk. I encourage you to tune into it. But really, it's about how in our shared economy, things like Uber, again, Airbnb, Lyft, whatever it may be, is helping to build trust through providing little digital insights into people. So there's a really kind of fascinating backstory to Airbnb and how it was born and so forth. But it's all about how trust is hard to build. Just if you're meeting a person for the very first time, we have this view of stranger danger, othering, like they're different than us. All of our unconscious biases say, stay away, flock to those that we know. And tools like just having the referrals, the positive ratings, the ability for a host home to say, hey, I have a dog, I have 2 kids, etc. Those little cues that build relationship have increased tremendously people's willingness to trust others. People trust, there's a Harvard study that came out not too long ago, people trust their Uber driver more than they do their neighbor
like the rating was 88% for their Uber driver and 42% for their neighbor. And so I think that there's hope in terms of what technology can bring in providing data and information that allows people to extend trust to each other and for people to receive that.
And then just Yrthya, I'll let you jump in fast.
Storytelling, the fact that more and more people are able to tell their story and share it with the world, I think will build trust. It's super important that we democratize who tells our stories.
Thank you so much, everyone.